Carolyn came out of the pastry shop, walked to the car, and noticed her husband standing on the sidewalk, looking somewhere in the distance. "David, why are you frozen? Come on, let's go. We're already late." "There's probably everyone already gathered at the table, only we're missing," she said in a disgruntled voice. It was as if David hadn't heard her, and the woman couldn't stand it, walked over and tugged at his sleeve. He looked at her with a strange look and then, as if reluctantly, headed for the car. Carolyn continued to grumble in the car, and David flew his thoughts to the recent past, when he was not married to Carolyn, but to Nicole, quiet, modest, loving woman. Nicole was his first love and first wife. They were so happy until Carolyn crossed his path, and then Nicole died. She was in a terrible and ridiculous accident, and there was nothing David could do for her. He only sobbed, hugging the coffin and begging Nicole for forgiveness. But even then, in those bitter days of hopelessness, he had no idea what he had really lost. After Nicole was gone, he wasn't happy for a single hour, not even when Carolyn gave birth to his son. David felt like an outsider in his new family and often wondered when it had all gone wrong. Probably the day when Carolyn appeared in the company where David worked, elegant, long-legged, dressed tastefully. She proudly held her head up and strode to her workplace, as if she were not a staff economist, but a director. David at the time was the head of the department, and he often had to deal on business issues with Carolyn, sometimes sitting with the documents late. One day, it so happened that their relationship crossed the line that usually lies between colleagues. The initiator was Carolyn. It was late evening, and the two of them were in the office, finishing summarizing the company's profit figures. Suddenly, Carolyn stood up, stretched gracefully, and then walked over and sat in David's lap. "What are you doing?" he whispered astonishingly. She silently untied his tie with her thin, skilled fingers, unbuttoned his shirt collar, and her lips pressed to his lips. "Carolyn, I'm married," David protested, but she moved on to more daring caresses. David could not push her away. And meanwhile, the faithful and loyal Nicole was waiting for him at home. David felt an incredible sense of shame in front of his wife, but he could not refuse Carolyn, and with each meeting he became more and more ashamed. Then one day, Carolyn told him that she was expecting a child. "David, you have to make a decision and make a choice between your wife and our baby. I hope you won't make the baby suffer." David only now realized what he had done. The passion that Carolyn had skillfully kindled in him had nothing to do with love. It was a feeling he only had for Nicole, and he did not want to lose her. Yes, he had become a traitor to her, but perhaps one day she could forgive him. "Carolyn, I'm sorry," David muttered. "Everything that happened between us was a mistake. I'm not giving up on the baby, and of course I'll help you, but my family is Nicole." Carolyn had a tough temper. That's why she didn't cry, as another woman would have done. She smiled vindictively and said, "So you want to remain a faithful husband? And do you think your wife will forgive you? Or has she already forgiven you? Doesn't she have an ounce of womanly pride in her?" "No, I haven't talked to her yet," David shook his head. "She's gone to visit her parents. I'll wait for her and tell her everything when she comes back." But Nicole didn't come back. 2 days after this conversation, her mother called and told David that she had been in a terrible accident and died. "We'll bury her here," Mrs. Mitchell said in a firm tone. "I want to be near my daughter, and you, if you want, may come to visit her grave." She said something else, but David couldn't hear her. In those days, he was like in a fog, and only falling down to his wife's closed coffin, he sobbed bitterly, regretting that he had not protected his beloved and moreover betrayed her. And so, several years had passed. Now David was married to Carolyn. They were raising a young son, and today came to a nearby state to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Carolyn's aunt. When they arrived in town, Carolyn asked her husband to stop outside a candy store, and David, while his wife was away, looked around the unfamiliar streets with interest. Suddenly, his gaze fell on the slender figure of a woman who had come out of the store on the opposite side. David shuddered as if he had been electrocuted. It was Nicole! His Nicole, the same Nicole he had mourned for all these years. How many times, secretly from Carolyn, he had come to the cemetery to visit his first wife and sat for long hours by her grave, talking to her as if she were alive. And now he saw her before him, alive. David wanted to rush out to her to call out Nicole, but the cry froze on his lips and his feet were stuck to the ground. It was a real shock, and there was no way David could move. It was at that moment that Carolyn returned. David had to make an incredible effort to get into the car, devoting himself to memories. He barely kept his eyes on the road. When they arrived at the place, and all of Carolyn's family sat down at the table, David told his wife that he wasn't feeling well and went into one of the rooms to rest. Finally being alone, he could quietly immerse himself in his thoughts. A happy family with Carolyn never worked out for him. Powerful and opinionated, she was not accustomed to take someone else's opinion. The first 2 years of the birth of his son were a real nightmare for David. He hoped that the caprices of pregnant Carolyn disappear when the baby comes into the world, but as it turned out, it was only the beginning. Carolyn was demanding that David run to her at the first call, disrupting important negotiations. One day she begged him to come urgently without explaining anything over the phone. David was going crazy with excitement for the child and drove home at such a speed that the wheels of the car barely touched the ground. But the door was opened by a smiling Carolyn. "You came, how nice," clapped a satisfied woman. "I missed you so much." "What's wrong with our son?" shouted David, losing his temper. "Nothing. He's asleep. What could possibly happen to him?" "Carolyn, what are you doing? Do you realize that I had an important meeting and I dropped everything and rushed to you?" "That's good. It means you love me," laughed Carolyn back. But he didn't love her. He had never loved her. There was only Nicole in his heart. But she was dead, or was she not dead? The thought so overwhelmed David that he sat up abruptly on the couch. He hadn't seen her dead after all. The coffin was closed and the funeral was kind of strange. David only now realized that Nicole's mother wasn't crying at all. At that time, he thought it was just a shock. And now he saw the whole situation quite differently. Exhausted by heavy thinking, David collapsed back on the couch. When Carolyn stopped by to ask him how he was doing, he already had a plan. "Carolyn, I'm sorry. I have to leave right away." "Wait, tomorrow night we're going to a restaurant. It's my aunt's anniversary. There'll be a lot of guests." "I'll try to make it," promised David. And despite his wife's displeasure, he got into the car and drove away. On the way, he stopped near a construction store, bought 2 shovels, work gloves, and a flashlight, and only then continued his way. He arrived at the cemetery where Nicole was buried in the evening. When it was quite dark, he followed a familiar path to his wife's grave and began to dig it up. And David, not accustomed to physical work, quickly rubbed blisters, but that did not stop him. Hour after hour passed, and David kept digging and digging, stopping only briefly to take a break. Finally, the shovel knocked on the lid of the coffin. David sighed heavily. Only now, he thought, that he would not be able to get the coffin to the surface. His nerves, as well as his physical strength, were at their limits, so he decided to open the lid of the coffin right there in the grave. The shovel banged against the half-rotten boards, and a large gap appeared in the coffin. When he managed to tear off the lid, he wept bitterly, realizing that he had actually buried several years ago. David met Dawn sitting in a grave on the wreckage of a wooden coffin. In his hands were albums and photographs in which he and Nicole were young and happy. Here in the coffin, David found a box covered with scarlet velvet, which he himself once given his wife. She kept all his gifts and small signs of attention he gave her in it. And all this meant only one thing. That day he did not bury his wife, but her love and his happiness. After taking all the finds from the grave, David somehow got the grave buried, and then, crushed by everything that had happened, he headed for the exit, dying of exhaustion. He got behind the wheel, drank some water, and immediately, without driving away from the cemetery, he fell soundly asleep. On the evening of the same day, Carolyn was very angry when she realized that David did not come in time. She went up to her aunt and apologized for her husband. "I didn't expect anything else from him," the aunt grinned. "You know, I never liked your David. He doesn't compare to Mason." "Auntie, come on. You know Mason wasn't as malleable as David. When Mason found out that he got me pregnant, he demanded that I get an abortion. But I've already done it a few times, and the doctors warned me that this was probably the last chance for me to become a mother. I couldn't let it go. In addition, I wanted to get back at Mason, so I turned my attention to David," Carolyn laughed. "Oh, if you could have known how crazy Mason was when he found out that I started dating with David." "And so David has no idea he's raising a non-native son?" asked the aunt with a smile. "Of course not. He's so trusting." While talking, the women didn't notice David, who came up from behind them with a huge bouquet of flowers. "Well," he said, "it's good relief that nothing needs explaining now." "David, you've got it all wrong. I'll explain," Carolyn whispered confusedly. "I got it all wrong before, and now it's all falling into place. Happy birthday." David handed the Jubilee flowers, then turned around and walked away. Carolyn rushed after him, grabbed his arm, began to beg to listen to her, but he calmly pulled away the weeping woman, and Carolyn realized that she had made a mistake, which could not be undone. And David drove straight to Mrs. Mitchell's house and asked the question that worried him. "Is Nicole alive?" "Don't keep quiet, Mrs. Mitchell. I know everything. I saw her at night and checked that she is not in the coffin. I love your daughter and have loved only her all these years." "David, if you loved her, then you wouldn't cheat on her." "How do you know that?" David looked up at her in shame. "One evening when Nicole was just visiting me, she got a cell phone call. It was your mistress. She told Nicole that she was expecting a child from you and that you love her. Nicole didn't tell me anything at the time. She just went to her room. She was gone for a long time. I decided to look in and was horrified to see a handful of pills in her hands. She had already taken some, and I called an ambulance to save my little girl. Do you realize I could have just lost her?" David sat with his head low, and Mrs. Mitchell ruthlessly continued, "Oh, David, if you only knew how much she loved you. Then in the hospital, she kept saying she didn't want to live anymore. I suggested that she talk to you, but she decided that since you had chosen someone else, she wouldn't bother you. You see, she decided to set you free. Rightly or wrongly, I supported her. Even though I knew full well that one day the truth would come out and you'd find out. Where is Nicole now? I want to see her." "Why? To torture her again?" "Please, David, don't disturb her life." "I won't give her up to anyone," David shook his head, "and I'll do anything to make her forgive me." "David, she loves you. She still can't get over you. But whether she'll forgive you, I don't know," Mrs. Mitchell sighed and gave her address. Hearing the doorbell ring, Nicole opened the door and immediately went pale as chalk. In front of her stood David, her first and only love, which she had never managed to erase from her memory. They stared at each other in silence, never taking their eyes off each other. Finally, Nicole pulled herself together and asked, "Why did he come?" "To tell you that I love you and always have. I made a terrible mistake once, and I'll never forgive myself for it. Nicole, I beg you every day to forgive me." "Go away, I don't believe you. You killed our love and I buried it." "Look what I have. This is proof our love cannot be buried." Nicole looked and recoiled when she saw the very photo albums and the scarlet box she had once buried. "Please, David, go away. I won't ruin your family. You have a child." "No family and no baby. She deceived me. He's not my son." "That doesn't change anything. So once again, please go away," bitterly said Nicole and closed the door. But David did not move away. He lowered himself along the wall and sat on the floor, wrapping his arms around his knees. He knew firmly that he would do anything to get Nicole back and felt that there, behind the door, she was just like him, sitting on the floor and listening to the beating of her heart he had been hurting. 3 years passed. David and Nicole were taking a walk in the park, not far from their house. Little son was sleeping soundly in a stroller, which David rolled in front of him. He put his other arm around his wife's newly rounded waist. "Darling, how lucky I am to have you in my life," David said, stopping and kissing Nicole. "I've been so stupid and blind, but now I will do anything to make you and our children happy. And I love you, David. You know, I felt so bad without you for those few awful years," said Nicole. "Please don't remember. I won't forget for the rest of my life what I owe you." Nicole smiled, looking into her husband's eyes and said, "Well, everyone in life can make mistakes." "Yes, but not everyone can forgive," David replied and hugged his wife again.